The faded lines in an old U.S. Army report from 1944 still read, "We could not understand why they were so astonished." Just over a cup of hot coffee. German prisoners, men who had endured the brutal winters of Europe, the endless nights in frozen trenches, the mornings thick with smoke and blood, now stood frozen in disbelief at the sight before them. Steam rising from a battered tin cup, coffee hot and real. Something that in wartime Europe felt like an impossible luxury. The sound of spoons tapping against metal mugs echoed through the Texas camp under the burning sun. A simple haunting aroma spread across the wooden barracks. Men in prison uniforms, faces worn and hollow, glanced at each other, then broke into quiet, almost guilty smiles as if afraid to trust what they were tasting. Perhaps none of them ever imagined that the enemy they had once faced on the battlefield would now serve them hot coffee every morning, a detail so small. Yet it opened a doorway into an entire hidden world where war and carnage outside the fence seemed far away, and the lives of German POWs in America became a strange, almost forgotten chapter. One that was at once human and bitter. And from that rising steam of morning coffee, we begin to follow a thread into a chapter of World War II, nearly erased from memory, where the defeated still clung to dignity in captivity, and where the victors at times chose treatment far different from the cruelty of the battlefield. Texas, 1944. The war raged oceans away, yet here in the flat expanses of the American South, a different story was unfolding. Long stretches of barbed wire cut across the landscape surrounding rows of barracks that looked more like hastily built farm sheds than cages for enemies of the state. Inside them lived thousands of German prisoners of war, captured soldiers, sailors, and airmen who once wore the swastika proudly on their uniforms, now reduced to faded shirts, numbered armbands, and weary eyes. They had been pulled from the ruins of North Africa, the shattered fields of France, the cold seas where U-boats prowled. And now, improbably, they found themselves under the relentless Texas sun, hearing cicadas instead of artillery, smelling mesquite smoke instead of cordite. The U.S. government had brought them here not only to isolate them from the war, but to use their labor in fields mills and small industries short on manpower. Farms that once cried out for help during harvest suddenly found themselves with young men from Bavaria or the Rhineland, picking cotton, cutting timber, hauling lumber. Local families would sometimes pause watching these strangers work the land, their blonde hair turned gold by the sun, their foreign songs carrying across the fields. They were enemies. Yet here they were sweating in the same soil that grew American crops. But captivity in Texas was not the nightmare many prisoners expected. Rumors had spread on battlefields that America treated its captives strangely well, but no one truly believed it until they tasted it. The camps were strictly guarded, yes, and discipline was harsh when tested. But there was food, real food, not the watery rations of the Eastern Front. There were blankets, books, even soccer balls. And every morning, without fail, there was hot coffee. To men who had survived on chicory substitutes and bitter black powder brewed in dented helmets, this simple luxury seemed almost surreal. Yet the contrast made the strangeness sharper. Outside the wire, American boys, some the same age as the Germans sipping their coffee, were still fighting and dying in Normandy's hedgerows, in the jungles of New Guinea, in the ruins of Monte Cassino. The war had not lost its hunger. But here inside the Texas camps, there was a pause, a curious suspension of brutality. The German POWs began to live between two realities, the memory of war's cruelty and the bewildering gentleness of captivity. And it was this tension, this contradiction that turned every small detail, every sip of coffee, every breath of hot Texas air, every glance at a guard who offered a cigarette instead of a rifle butt into a symbol of something larger. Something that would blur the lines between enemy and human conqueror, and captive cruelty and compassion. The facts of the Texas POW camps were in themselves remarkable. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 400,000 German prisoners were shipped to the United States. Nearly 50,000 of them found themselves scattered across Texas, spread out in dozens of camps from the piney woods of the east to the arid plains of the west. The largest Camp Hearn was nicknamed the Fritz Ritz by locals half in jest and half in suspicion, because it offered the kind of living conditions that seemed unimaginable for wartime enemies. The camp held over 800 men at its peak, with barracks, mess halls, a hospital, and even a small library. Reports in U.S. Army records confirm that the treatment of prisoners was directly influenced by the Geneva Convention. America, determined to set an example, maintained standards that often surpassed what its own soldiers received overseas. Each prisoner was allotted calories equivalent to the diet of a U.S. soldier: meat, vegetables, bread, and yes, coffee. The coffee rations, according to military quartermaster logs, amounted to nearly a pound per prisoner per week, ensuring that the brew was served steaming hot every morning in tin mugs lined up along long wooden tables. Newspapers from the time captured local astonishment. Headlines in Texas dailies spoke of enemy soldiers helping harvest cotton and German prisoners well fed in local camps. One article from 1944 noted with some resentment that the POWs were served better meals than many American families on the rationing system. Housewives clipped coupons for sugar and meat, while behind the wire the prisoners ate sausage potatoes and thick slices of bread. The irony was not lost on those reading the morning paper over thin wartime coffee. Archival photographs preserved in the National Archives show POWs standing in neat lines, dressed in plain khaki uniforms, marked with large PW stenciled across the back. Some smile holding mugs in their hands. Others look wary, suspicious of the camera lens their faces caught between shame and relief. Guards, often young Americans from small towns, stand at their posts but appear relaxed, sometimes chatting with prisoners, sometimes laughing together, in fleeting moments that blurred the lines of war. The official records tell us that discipline within the camps was overall stable. While some hardliners tried to maintain Nazi order inside the wire, most men adapted quickly. Diaries kept by prisoners, later uncovered by historians, reveal astonishment at the generosity of their captors. One German soldier wrote, "Every day begins with hot coffee. It is stronger than anything we had in years. I drink it slowly, as if not to wake from a dream." These facts are more than statistics. They are fragments of a reality that contradicts our instinctive image of wartime captivity. They force us to ask, was this leniency an act of strategy, a showpiece for American values, or simply an accident of abundance in a land far from the bombing raids of Europe? Beyond the ledgers and reports, there were the whispers. The kind of stories that never made it into official documents, but lingered in the memory of men long after the war ended. In the Texas heat behind the wire, the German POWs began to weave their own folklore, half astonished recollection, half myth, shaped by the strangeness of their captivity. One tale told again and again was of the endless coffee pot. Prisoners swore that no matter how many mugs were poured, the big tin kettles in the mess hall never seemed to run dry. In Germany, the war had turned coffee into a phantom beans, replaced by roasted barley or acorns, a bitter taste of deprivation. But here, in a land where coffee ships from South America still docked in New Orleans and Galveston, the supply seemed bottomless. Men joked that perhaps Texas itself grew coffee like wheat, that the soil was so rich, even beans could spring from it. There were stories, too, of guards who slipped extra sugar into their cups. POWs whispered of one Texan sergeant, with a drawl so thick they barely understood him, who nonetheless always nudged the pot toward the men at the end of the line. They called him the angel of coffee, half mockery, half gratitude. In prisoner diaries, he appears again and again, a nameless figure whose small kindness became part of the legend of Texas captivity. Among the locals, folklore took its own shape. Farmers who worked side by side with the POWs told tales of German songs floating through the fields at dusk, harmonies carried on the warm wind. Some claimed the prisoners sang lullabies to the crop's old folk tunes from the Black Forest or Bavarian mountains, as if coaxing cotton to grow taller. Children in nearby towns told each other stories of enemy soldiers who carved wooden toys from scrap lumber and left them hanging on fence posts. Mothers collected these toys, handmade dolls carved birds, small boats, and treasured them, both curious and uneasy about accepting gifts from men once sworn to Hitler. After the war, when many POWs returned to a ruined Germany, the stories of Texas camps followed them home. In villages reduced to rubble, men told their families about mornings with hot coffee, about guards who treated them with an odd mixture of strictness and courtesy, about the bizarre, dreamlike quality of captivity in America. Some villagers refused to believe it, insisting that no prisoner could have been treated so well. The men swore it was true. For years in post-war Germany, the phrase "Texas coffee" became a private joke among veterans who had lived through those mornings, a memory that blurred the line between enemy and host. And in these fragments of folklore, in these small human details, we see how myth was born even in captivity, how memory transformed simple rituals into something almost magical. And how for the men who carried these stories home, the smell of hot coffee became more haunting than the sound of gunfire. The Texas camps were not accidents of generosity. They were part of a vast system calculated and carefully designed. From Washington to the far reaches of the plains, the United States built an entire network of prisoner management, over 500 camps across the nation, each linked by rail lines, supply chains, and paperwork that flowed like rivers through the War Department. At the heart of this system was the Geneva Convention. Every rule, every ration, every privilege granted to the German POWs was weighed against the treaty signed years before. America wanted to show the world, and perhaps itself, that it could fight a total war without losing its moral compass. So the regulations were written down in meticulous detail. Calories per prisoner, hours of labor allowed, access to mail and religious services, all logged, all checked, all watched. The prisoners worked under contract. Cotton fields, sawmills, road gangs. Farmers paid the government, not the men, but each POW earned small credits they could spend in camp canteens. Cigarettes, razor blades, soap, even postcards to send home. The flow of goods was astonishing compared to the shortages ravaging Europe. To a man who once starved on the Eastern Front, the sight of shelves lined with chocolate and coffee tins seemed like stepping into a dream with a price tag. Discipline was another pillar. The camps ran on a balance between firmness and restraint. Guards were trained not to humiliate, not to abuse. Punishment existed, but it was swift, regulated, and visible extra duties. Confinement loss of privileges. This prevented chaos, but also created predictability. The men understood the rules. And within those boundaries, a strange kind of order bloomed. Soccer matches were organized, orchestras formed, even theaters built from scrap lumber. Inside the wire, a society reassembled itself, one that mirrored Germany, but softened by the odd comfort of Texas captivity. And yet, there was always the fence. Always the towers, the rifles, the dogs pacing in the dust. For every act of kindness, there was the reminder of control. The barbed wire glinted in the sun like a warning. No matter how good the coffee tasted, they were still prisoners. It was this duality, the strict system of regulation, wrapped in layers of unexpected comfort, that defined the Texas POW experience. A machine of captivity that functioned with mechanical precision. But inside it, thousands of men began to taste something more complicated. Safety, dignity, and the confusing realization that even in defeat, life could feel more humane than in the armies they once served. And as this system ran day after day, it built pressure. Whispers of resentment among locals, stirring of resistance among hardline prisoners. And the haunting question, what did such generosity mean in a world still burning with war? The system, as smooth as it seemed, could not contain the friction forever. Beneath the order of rations and routines, beneath the neat rows of bunks and the morning clatter of tin mugs, tension smoldered, waiting. Some prisoners accepted the strange kindness of captivity. They worked, they played soccer, they wrote letters home. But others, diehards, men who still clung to Hitler's shadow, saw the camps as battlegrounds of ideology. They whispered in corners, organized secret cells, punished fellow prisoners who went soft. In Camp Herne, men loyal to the Reich formed underground tribunals. Prisoners accused of defeatism were beaten in the dark, some even strangled with wire in barracks that looked quiet from the outside. Official reports recorded suicides. But survivors later admitted the truth: these were executions carried out by prisoners against their own. Escape attempts punctured the calm. At night, under the vast Texas sky, men dug tunnels with spoons, dreaming of reaching Mexico. One group nearly made it, crawling for weeks through the dust. They surfaced miles from camp, only to be discovered by a farmer's hounds. Others slipped into cotton fields, blending in with labor crews, hoping to vanish in the sprawl of America. Most were caught within days. But the attempts became legend among the prisoners. Proof that the war in some secret corner of their minds was still alive. Outside the wire, resentment grew. Families rationing meat and sugar read headlines about prisoners eating hearty meals, drinking endless coffee. Better fed than our boys overseas, muttered farmers, though many relied on POW labor to save their crops. Mothers who lost sons in Normandy bristled at the sight of German prisoners laughing in camp soccer matches. The contradiction cut deep. Some guards hardened their voices sharper. Their rifles carried a little tighter. And then there were the moments of collision, when enemy and enemy stared at each other without a battlefield between them. A Texas farmer's daughter delivering eggs to the mess hall caught the eyes of a young prisoner. Just a glance, but enough to spark whispers. A German carpenter carving toys for local children, handing them through the fence. A guard who one morning slipped his own ration of cigarettes into a prisoner's hand and in return received a quiet danke. Small acts, impossible to regulate, that blurred the clean lines of war. But the contradictions built toward rupture. In 1943 and 1944, several murders inside the camps shocked the War Department. Nazi hardliners killing moderates. Moderates begging guards for protection. One American officer wrote in his diary, "The enemy kills itself under our care. The barbed wire is not strong enough to hold back their fear of each other." And all the while, the coffee was poured. Steam rose from mugs as though nothing had changed. But to the men holding them, each sip carried the weight of confusion. Gratitude mixed with guilt, safety poisoned with suspicion. Comfort shadowed by the war they could not leave behind. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the barbed wire did not vanish overnight. The camps remained humming with the same routines: coffee at dawn, labor in the fields, soccer on dusty patches of grass. But slowly, orders came down from Washington. Trains would run again, not with new arrivals, but with departures. German POWs, once scattered across America, would be gathered, processed, and sent home to a country in ruins. The men who had lived in Texas carried with them two worlds stitched uneasily together. They remembered the brutality of war. The nights in foxholes, the friends buried in foreign soil, the swastika armbands that now felt like shackles. But they also remembered mornings in captivity that seemed almost unreal. The clatter of tin mugs, the smell of strong coffee, the laughter of guards who were supposed to be their enemies. For many, those memories became harder to explain than the battles themselves. Letters written decades later tell of the strange homesickness for camp life. One former prisoner confessed, "I dreamed of the Texas sun, of the taste of coffee, of the sound of English words. I never understood, but somehow trusted." Another admitted that he missed the simplicity of routine, the certainty of food and safety, things denied to him in shattered post-war Germany. Families hungry and cold in bombed-out villages listened in disbelief as returning soldiers spoke of American barracks stocked with bread of guards who treated them like men, not animals. Some even accused them of lying. For the United States, the aftermath carried its own contradictions. Locals who had once resented the prisoners now remembered them with curiosity. Farmers recalled the harvests saved by German labor. Children grown older kept the carved toys left behind. Even in bitterness, there lingered a sense of connection, strange, fleeting, and unforgettable. The legacy of these camps seeped quietly into history. They were not front lines, not battlefields. No medals were earned behind the wire. Yet they revealed something unsettling, that war, even at its most total, could leave space for gestures of humanity. That a nation at war could offer comfort to the very men sent to destroy it. And that those men hardened by ideology and violence could carry home stories not of hatred but of kindness. Stories that blurred the sharp edge of enmity. And so long after the last mug of coffee was poured, after the last train rolled eastward, carrying weary prisoners back across the Atlantic, the question remained. What was captivity in Texas? A triumph of American ideals, a strange accident of geography and abundance? Or simply a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of war, the smallest rituals, a cup of coffee at dawn, a smile exchanged across a language barrier, can echo longer than the thunder of guns? And perhaps that is the riddle left behind. How can war so merciless allow for memories this gentle? How can men who once fought with rifles now remember above all the taste of hot coffee in captivity? Was it mercy or merely circumstance? A fleeting accident of history? Or proof that even enemies remain human? The files close, the steam fades from the cup, and the barbed wire rusts under the Texas sun. But the question lingers unanswered. You have just listened to another hidden file from the war's shadowed archives. If you wish to uncover more stories that prisoners, generals, and wartime industries never told in full, subscribe now. The next story may be one history tried to forget, but we will not.